Chapter 28. Wednesday late morning. Mac parked downtown in one of those metered parking areas and hopped out. Then he put some money into the machine and walked around to open the door for her. Doreen made her way out, having managed to get her new leash and harness on Goliath and one on Muggs. With Thaddeus on her shoulder, she walked across the street. Just before they got to the other side, though, Goliath decided he didn't want to walk with a leash. Doreen had to admit she hadn't given him much chance to get used to it yet. Goliath lay down like on strike until Mac scooped him up. A harness and a leash for a cat? This cat? Goliath? Mac asked. Are you serious? It seemed like a good idea, she muttered. But you know what it's like to get a cat to do anything you want them to do. They start off with all good intentions, and then head in the opposite direction. Up ahead was no sign of Peter. Doreen walked around the corner, but he wasn't there either. Is this where you met him the other day? Mac asked. She nodded. Right here. I sat on the bench at this end, and he sat on the bench at that end. But he did say he often went to the park to sleep. She motioned across the street where they'd just come from and said, let's go check it out. With the traffic being almost dead, they quickly made their way across the street again. And once Goliath saw the grass, he seemed much more amenable to walking on the leash. But Doreen knew it would only work as long as he chose to go in the same direction she went. When they finally made it into the park and the heavy trees, Mac spread out a little so they could look around. She called out, Peter. Are you here? Somewhere to the left, she heard a snuffle. She walked in that direction, and sure enough, there was Peter, curled on the ground in front of a big tree. She frowned and said, now I feel like I should have brought you coffee. He opened his eyes, stared at her, and said, I won't say no to coffee. But I don't have any right now, she said with a sigh. Peter looked at Muggs, who was sniffing him up and down. Can I pet him? Sure, she said. He reached out to give Muggs a head scratch. Muggs's tail went crazy, and that sniffer of his went even more so. And then Peter's eyes landed on Goliath, and they widened. Wow, he said. I haven't seen a cat on a leash before. You may never again, she said darkly, as she pulled on Goliath to come join them. Goliath just gave her a look, his body going in the opposite direction. Peter laughed. I guess you've got a ways to go in that cat training, huh? Yes, she said. Still, it's all good. We're getting somewhere, and the more he has time with the leash, the better. Peter didn't look at all convinced, but then neither was she. Goliath just lay here, sideways, his tail flicking, until he rolled over, pulling the leash even farther and forcing her to take a step closer now as he lay on his back with his forepaws in the air, just staring up at the blue sky. He's a very unique animal, she said. That he is, Peter said. Now what are you doing back here? Doreen motioned to where Mac stood. This is my friend Mac, she said as she motioned for him to join them. Peter looked at him and frowned. He looks like a cop. He is, Doreen said cheerfully, but he's one of the good guys. But Mac's presence and size did little for Peter's suspicious nature. He has news for you, she said gently. So, we figured you'd like to hear it personally. Fear filled his eyes. Peter looked up at Mac and said, What is it? What's wrong? Doreen squatted in front of Peter and said, They found Manny. His jaw dropped and his eyes widened. And then he realized what they meant. Dead, he croaked. She nodded. I'm so sorry. His eyes filled with tears. It's not fair. He never had much of a life. I know, Doreen said gently. And I know it's not the news you wanted to hear. It's not the news I wanted you to hear either, but they just found him yesterday, and we didn't want you to hear about it from the media. Peter wiped his runny eyes with his dirty sleeve. Thank you, he muttered, his voice still choked with tears. He looked over at Mac. When and how did he die? And will you guys care now when you didn't back then? Doreen reached out a hand and gently rubbed his forearm. They tried back then, honest. But it's hard to know what could have happened to him. Remember? You didn't have any information to help them out with, either. Shamefaced, Peter nodded. I'm sorry. That's not fair. I was so high back then that I didn't know what was important either. Mac crouched in front of him. Do you have anything new to offer now? Nothing more than I told her, he said, with a nod in Doreen's direction. But maybe now that you have Manny, maybe you can find out more? Hopefully, Mac said. That's the plan.